Is that going to be?
On the previous episode of Talk to Al Jazeera, we spoke to Eeben Barlow, the founder of a South African-based private army. Here's what he told us.
The operation was in three phases. The first phase was to actually cut a dividing line across northeastern Nigeria and isolate Boko Haram into two defined areas. We were not allowed to finish because it came at a time when governments were in the process of changing. President Jonathan's government possibly saw the entire Boko Haram contract, if we call it that, almost as a last gasp in order to regain popularity. The incoming president, President Buhari, was heavily supported by a foreign government, and one of the first missions was to terminate our contract.
Could you name that foreign government?
Yes, we were told it was the United States.
Now, here's part two of our conversation with Eeben Barlow.
Let's talk more about money. Is it the only thing that would get you to accept a contract? And what jobs you have turned down?
First of all, let's start with what we've turned down. I'm not going to go through the whole list, but I will take you back to a country which was known as Zaire, now known as the Democratic Republic of Congo, where a previous president asked us to get involved in assassinating one of his ministers.
Who's that president?
That was President Mobutu. He wanted his minister assassinated because the minister was caught stealing money. You know, we're not in the business of carrying out assassinations on behalf of governments. We will go in to help a government that's in a conflict situation and that has actually given up hope. And in fact, we're the last people they turn to. And sometimes it can be too late to actually help that government. I think the second part of that question is we're approached by governments. We don't go and tell governments that they must give us a contract. But we work in an area now where the playing field is very unlevel, and I say unlevel because governments have to pay us, whereas a lot of the foreign companies that come in are sponsored by their host government, so it costs the government nothing. So the coin is flipped to either pay the South Africans or the South African company to come in, or to take what's offered for free. Invariably, they take what's offered for free.
And do you believe that it's free?
No, of course not. There's always an exchange. There's always a string attached somewhere. And that string could be resources, influence, etc.
We are still in Africa, but with another protagonist, the Russian Wagner. There have been reports that it has cloned your once pioneer company executive outcomes business model in Angola and Sierra Leone in securing their paychecks by way of mining concessions. Is this your business model?
I think let's go back to the so-called mining concessions. That was a story sucked out of their thumbs by the pre-1994 South African military intelligence. I have the intelligence reports marked secret, claiming that we are being paid in oil and diamonds. And I've never been able to understand how men would work for a barrel of oil a day or a month or a week. We need funds, money to sustain ourselves. We need to be able to pay for medical expenses. We need to be able to feed our men, and we cannot do that on oil and diamonds. So let's just be very honest and straightforward about that. That is a lie. And the paper that published that, very interestingly, took it from an old South African military intelligence report, which tells me that somewhere, someone is feeding them disinformation, and in order to make it real are just perpetuating lies. So as far as that media outlet is concerned, I regard them with the contempt they deserve. Secondly, many companies have tried to clone executive outcomes, not only the Russian company. Companies in the West have tried to clone executive outcomes and have admitted to that. The irony is that as soon as the Russian company came in, suddenly they were the ones that cloned the company. And that story started as well in a media, in a mainstream media system, which claimed that I was actually responsible for helping them to establish Wagner. So, you know, when it comes to companies such as that and stories such as that myself or either STEP got involved in helping to establish Wagner, just a piece of fake news that actually any normal, sensible person will discard with the contempt that deserves. Coming to Mozambique, these people came into Mozambique not understanding the conflict, not understanding the origins of the conflict, not understanding the operational environment, not understanding the area of operations, not even understanding the people and their culture, and rushed in. And that's not how you contain a conflict in Africa. If arrogance and overconfidence become the foundation upon which you operate, you are going to get hurt.
In a previous single interview, you said, and let me quote you, "There are certain PMCs that enjoy the privileges of their own states. We are not." End of the quote. Reports say the Wagner is one of those companies that uses Russian army and navy transport facilities, and sometimes the combatants fight side by side with the Russian army. Does that represent unfair competition to your company?
Well, of course it's unfair competition if you regard it as that. You know, Western PMCs or Russian and even Chinese that are operating on this continent make use of their national armed forces. Many of them, or most of them, are actually paid by their host governments. We do not have that luxury. We do not have a government that supports us in terms of a host government. So what we have to go and try and secure for the company, we have to do in such a way that the government is willing to pay us. And as I said earlier, the opposite side is they believe they're getting something for free, which they're not getting for free. But those are choices governments make. But it does actually muddy the waters substantially because of the way a lot of these people have behaved in Africa and have actually got involved in criminal activities. But ironically, the media chooses to always focus on executive outcomes and companies that have been successful, and those that commit crimes on this continent are ignored. They're never written about. The fact that they're supported by their own governments is never mentioned. And I actually find that a little bit hypocritical, because what it does say to me is that as long as Africa is in a state of conflict, a lot of people are very happy because they're making their money out of it.
Do you think that Wagner is going to be a kind of a game changer in the continent?
Well, I don't think so, unless they start learning lessons very, very quickly. I think what the casualties that Wagner suffered, and don't get me wrong, I do not rejoice when any
Are you talking about the casualties in Mozambique?
In Mozambique. I don't rejoice when any people are killed of a private military company or a national armed force, but they're going to certainly have to up their game and start realizing that this is not Europe that they're operating in, or the Middle East. It's a very different continent.
But what happened to that once progressing and relaxed country like Mozambique? I mean, it was stable, progressing, and peaceful. Why such influx of PMCs?
Ironically, they discovered oil and gas. It doesn't take rocket science to figure out that any country that discovers oil and gas is suddenly going to find themselves under severe threat from many quarters as people try to claim that oil and gas for themselves. We see in Mozambique, shortly after the oil and gas discovery was announced, a previous liberation movement known as Renamo suddenly reappeared with new equipment and new uniforms. Where did they get that from? So you can look at any country.
Where do you think they're getting that from?
Well, we can only speculate on that, so I don't have the proof of it. But it doesn't take rocket science to figure out who was up there when the oil and gas was discovered. Have a look at a country such as Zimbabwe, which does not have oil and gas. No one is interested in it. Look at a country such as the DRC, which is rich in minerals. Everybody has an interest in it. A country such as Nigeria that has oil, everyone is interested in it. So, you know, the resources that countries have, although it ought to be a blessing, is in many cases a curse for those countries.
Would like to listen to your take on the DRC and what's happening in the DRC and the MONUSCO.
I think, first of all, if you really look at the DRC and the amount of money that's been put into it to end this conflict, I don't think it's been very well spent. I need to point out that the UN has always been very critical of the companies that I have chaired. Perhaps it's because the UN doesn't like the conflicts to end, number one. Number two, I would like to say that the UN has had a perfect opportunity to end the conflicts, but this hasn't happened. And I really need to understand in my mind why they've not been able to end these conflicts. Eastern DRC is a mineral-rich area, but it has also become a haven for religious and criminal-inspired terrorist groups, liberation movements, whatever you want to call them, and yet the UN has done nothing. However, the UN has actually sat and watched people being slaughtered and not gone to their rescue. And I find as any force claiming to be there to ensure peace, I think these actions are despicable. I cannot understand how people can claim that they want to secure peace and bring about peace when they watch people being slaughtered. And people cannot tell me that the area is too big to control. That is absolute nonsense. And if people say that, they are really trying to cover their own inability to do their jobs.
Maybe it's because of the different nature of the two jobs, your job, your company's job, and the job of the United Nations peacekeeping troops, because they are out there to keep the peace, which is non-existent. Your mission sometimes is to enforce peace.
I hear your argument. However, how do you keep peace between two warring countries? Why hasn't the UN intervened between General Haftar's people and the government in Tripoli? Why haven't they intervened in Syria if they're so concerned with keeping peace? And do not get me wrong, I'm not discounting the UN as an organization, but I'm saying there are elements in it that are certainly not doing their jobs. How can you claim to be peacekeepers if you can't keep peace? So to me, there's just a little bit of a twist on what's happening in there. That conflict could have been ended a long time ago. But I think that there's both domestic and international will lacking, because there are many companies that are currently in the DRC exploiting those mineral resources illegally for their own benefit. And under the watchful gaze of the UN. We've seen this happen time and time again. However, the UN will target us and single us out, yet they hire contractors. They make use of PMCs to clear mines, to help move logistics, etc. But no one talks about that. And in that case, it tells me that there's actually a large amount of hypocrisy going on here.
Let's expand on this. You always say, let me quote you on this, PMCs are more efficient and much less costly in bringing conflicts to an end in comparison to the United Nations peacekeeping troops. In light of the UN Convention that bans mercenary activities, don't you think that privatizing conflicts can work as a runaway train?
We've never advertised or promoted the idea of privatizing conflict. What I have said is that the input of PMCs into a conflict, as long as you are part of that national military, can actually end the conflict quicker and cheaper than what the United Nations or others can do. And I would like to take you back to the genocide in Rwanda. The UN did contact us, no matter how much they deny it. They called us from Geneva and asked if we could intervene. We submitted a strategy. That strategy was developed.
When did that happen?
This was in 1994, 95. I cannot remember the exact dates of the genocide. It was submitted to the UN. The UN came back and said that we have to procure all of the equipment that we would need, which included the vehicles, the air transport, the medical support, the weapons, the ammunition, the uniforms, etc., etc. The figure came to $100 million, if I recall correctly, for a 6-month period, because that was what we were asked for. It was declined because it was too expensive. The UN instead tried to do it themselves. That cost $150 million for 6 months, and the genocide actually occurred. So, you know, to me, there's a very clear distinction between cost efficiency and just spending money. We have never wasted a government's money, and they have never told us we are wasting their money. And we never go into a conflict with our own equipment. We make use of a government's equipment. So, you know, the stories that is propagated in the media, that we come with helicopters and tanks and heavy equipment, are all lies. Those are all, I cannot swear on camera, but it's rubbish. We make use of what that government has. Certain critical equipment we will ask them to procure, but we don't procure it because it's that government's equipment. But yes, we have been much cheaper than what the UN has been, and probably will ever be until someone fixes this Department of Peacekeeping.
In light of this, do you think there's a real need to renegotiate a new convention that would regulate the BMC industry? BMC is industry, and in order to put more restrictions to stop the violations attributed to some of these companies?
Well, let's go back to South Africa. There was a law promulgated to actually control private military contractors operating outside of the country. I think South Africa found itself in a unique position. It had just gained independence, it had become, or democracy rather, and it suddenly felt that it owed this to Africa to prevent people running around causing conflict and mayhem across the continent. We actually contributed to that bill that was finally passed in Parliament for the simple reason that many companies set themselves up claiming to be executive outcomes, all illegally, all trying to get contracts under our name. We were one of the very first companies that were actually awarded a contract to operate or licensed to operate by the South African government. The media ever discounted that, and I was told it's not in the public's interest to know that. So if it's not in the public's interest to know that we actually have a license to operate, why do we then get a license to operate? Why are we then subjected to continual lies and disinformation about the company? And why do we actually have to put up with it? That's the one side of the coin. The other side of the coin is that this industry has given birth to many people that are nothing other than chancers. They will take whatever chance they have. They will deceive governments in order to secure contracts. Unfortunately, though, their deception leads to the loss of life on this continent. And unless Africa puts a stop to it, it's not going to end. But to stop it, governments need to develop very strong and decisive political will.
Is this the reason why the same year you had yourself licensed in South Africa, you decided to dissolve your company?
Well, first of all, I left Executive Outcomes because I'd been targeted for assassination several times in South Africa. I'd become exhausted from having to fight a battle against a threat in a foreign country, as well as the media, the South African Department of Foreign Affairs, certain private interests that were held with rebel movements, as well as South African military intelligence. And all of this was being fought in the media against us, although other actions were put in place to try and stop us, as I say, me being assassinated. I left Executive Outcomes because I was exhausted. I'd become mentally and physically exhausted of fighting this on a day-to-day basis. And how do you defend yourself against continual lies? You cannot. That said, that the closure of Executive Outcomes happened after I left the company. I'd left the company and it closed down approximately 6 months after I left. And the reason it closed down is something that they can best explain, the men to who I gave the company. But I was told that there were several arguments amongst themselves about the future of the company and who would get what. And governments didn't want to talk to them if I wasn't there. So I wasn't prepared to go back and just put myself through the same actions of having to fight the lies and deception of the media anymore.
In spite of the United Nations Convention banning the mercenary activities, we know that the international organization hired some of the BMCs to do some jobs. Could you give us some examples? And why would you think that the United Nations would have such a convention and turn around and hire companies like yours?
I can't speak on behalf of the UN. What I can say is that when we were in Sierra Leone, we assisted the World Food Programme to safely deliver food to people in isolated areas. At that stage, we were good enough for the UN. More recently, they've been contracting companies that provide the services of logistics to them, oftentimes medical support, the clearing of landmines, etc. So I don't understand what the whole argument is. Private military companies would not be necessary if national armies and the United Nations were able to actually fulfill their mandates. So I don't think the world should lay the blame before us. They should go and look why we exist.
Did the African Union at any point use your expertise?
No, the African Union has not made use of our services because it comprises government organizations. However, I have been a speaker at African Union conferences, especially in relation to the establishment of what's known as the African Standby Force, in which I was asked to deliver my opinion as to what could make a standby force work or not work.
Your company, STEP, claims to have been operating in Africa, in Asia, in the Middle East. Could you give us some examples of these operations?
We worked in South America, we worked in Indonesia. We were asked to go to Saudi Arabia after the massacre of the pilgrims had taken place. We liaised with the Saudi National Guard, gave our input, and obviously we've worked extensively across Africa.
So you trained Saudi security on how best to keep security for the pilgrims?
No, we were asked to write a strategy for them, and that is what we did. We did not involve ourselves in the training, because that training was done by foreign armed forces, not private companies.
Mr. Barlow, did you at any time execute an order or ordered assassination during the time you headed CCB, the Civil Cooperation Bureau, Executive Outcome, or STEP?
I've never done that, and it's always interesting to me that this question is asked. CCB was a very covert wing of the South African Special Forces. The region I was in did not make up our own orders. We operated with orders from our hierarchy that were given to us. Any order that I received, whether I was in CCB or in the armed forces, never had to do with assassinating people. And secondly, within executive outcomes or STEP, anyone who says that is really looking for a fake story. These types of instructions have never been issued to anyone.
But you have been ordered before to execute assassination, and you refused.
Yes, I have been. There was an instance when I was in CCB where I was tasked on a mission, and I simply refused the mission because the person or persons, in my opinion, did not constitute a threat to the Republic of South Africa. So I'm not going to go out and murder someone in order to take revenge on behalf of a politician or someone else.
And how did it end up?
I ultimately lost my job.
So you sacrificed your job for not executing the order?
Well, I think we became politically expedient, but it was a good way to get rid of me, yes.
In the middle of all these wars against you and your companies, recently you were appointed by the government of Sao Tome as honorary consul. How did that happen, and what are your plans within the new job as a diplomat?
Well, first of all, Sao Tome approached me. I did not approach that government. I was also advised that several governments had discussed me as a potential option for their consul in South Africa. It was agreed I should get it for sacrifice and service to Africa. My job is to try and expand the interests of Sao Tome in South Africa and vice versa. And to that extent, a lot of work has already been done that will favor both South Africa and Sao Tome.
Mr. Barlow, thank you very much for talking to Al Jazeera.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.